Hello students, in this class we will discuss about various methods of teaching English. First we will take up grammar translation method. This method, also known as the classical method, is one of the oldest or traditional methods of teaching English. In Europe, it was used in the teaching of Latin and Greek for several centuries, and got introduced in India with the arrival of the British. This method makes no provision for training in speech but lays stress on reading. This method gives equal importance to grammar in the course in as much as the linguistic material presented for the study is graded on a grammatical plan and teaches the meaning of new English words, phrases and sentences by means of word-by-word translation in the vernacular. This method has no psychological basis but has two suppositions. Number one, that a foreign language can easily be learned through the translation, and that two, the grammar is the soul of the language. While criticizing this method, Rose remarks that the aim of this method was to know everything about something rather than thing itself. Students found the method frustrating as they had to memorize words and rules. The use of L1 in the classroom prevented the learner from developing confidence to communicate in English. The learners found it very difficult to emancipate themselves from the clutches of their mother tongue. They were unable to use English in their day-to-day communication. The excessive obsession with accuracy and competence in written rather than oral language inhibited learners who often preferred to remain silent rather than expose their ignorance. The emphasis in this method is mainly on translation of English words, phrases, and passages into and from the mother tongue of a learner. The traditional approach then seems to have been developed to meet the needs of rapidly expanding popular education in the latter part of the 19th century. Before 1875, members of the elite classes learned foreign languages through individualized instruction by native instructors. The advocates of this method assert that it is based on some sound principles such as foreign phraseology is best interpreted through translation. A foreign phraseology is best assimilated in the process of interpretation. The structure of foreign language can best be taught by comparing and contrasting it with that of mother tongue, and this has the best effect through translation. Next, we take up bilingual method, a method of language teaching developed by C.J. Dawson to improve the audio-visual method as it was advocated in the 1960s. Its architecture is best understood as a traditional three-phase structure of presentation, practice, and production. A lesson cycle starts out with the reproduction performance of a basic dialogue, moves on to the variation and recombination of the basic sentence, semi-free use of language, and ends up with an extended application stage characterized by the free communicative exploitation of the previous work. Well-ordered activities are to take the students up to a conversational level in the shortest possible time. In audiovisual courses, basic dialogues are presented and practiced over several months on a purely oral basis. Dawson, however, proposed a well-tested procedure where the printed sentence is presented simultaneously to the oral utterances from the beginning. Teachers may read out the dialogue to the class just once with the books closed, but as soon as they get the class to say the lines after them, books should be opened and the class is allowed to glance at the text in between imitation responses as they listen to others and look up when they speak themselves. Audiovisual textbooks present dialogues with a picture stripe on the left. The pictures also available on the slides are designed to closely match the meaning of the dialogue sentences. It was claimed that at long last, the necessary media, slides, and audio tapes had been made available to do justice to direct method principles and to teach without relying on the mother tongue. Pictures and slides along with the teacher's drawings should clarify the meaning of new words and structures. By contrast, Dawson provides the most direct form of access to meaning possible by using oral mother tongue equivalents at sentence level to convey the meaning of unknown words or structures. Interference from the mother tongue is avoided because the teacher says each dialogue sentence twice with the mother tongue version sandwiched between. It is the direct succession of the second or foreign language stimulus and the imitation response which prevents interference. Not word, but utterance equivalents are given, either whole utterances or meaningful parts of an utterance. The teacher chooses the closest natural equivalent which accomplishes what probably no other method of semantic thing can do so directly and so sensitively, that is, conveying the precise communicative value of the utterance. Whereas an isolated word equivalent is neutral in terms of intonation, teachers can now show how the utterance is meant by using their voice and body, intonation, stress, and gestures, both for the original sentence and for the equivalent. Moreover, natural idiomatic translations include, for instance, typical. Through this technique of meaning conveyance, authentic literary text become available even to beginners, quite an important side effect. There need not be that demotivating content vacuum so typical of beginners' materials. The bilingual method proceeds step by step under careful guidance with continual feedback, ensuring that prerequisites, sub or part skills are acquired before a final stage of free and spontaneous language use, all within an integrated lesson cycle. Learners are led from knowing nothing about any language situation to complete mastery of the situation, from a mastery of one situation to a mastery of sentence variations and combinations, and from a mastery of known situation combinations to portray into new, unknown, and unforeseeable communication situations. It is argued that free message oriented use of new language, when attempted too early in the lesson cycle and on too flimsy a basis, would only undermine the people's confidence. Peoples are trying to take these linguistic leaps, which are at the same time concept leaps. With the right type of substitutions, the teachers can help the students to pursue the structure as valid and relevant to their communication needs. Finally, students take over, make up their own sentences or chain sentences together, and may thus venture into new situations. The native language, and to some extent the teacher is no longer needed, and the exercises becomes monolingual. Dawson terms this stage as independent speaking of the sentences and regards it as a vital semi-creative intermediate step to genuine message oriented communication. The next method is a direct method. The direct method, sometimes called also as a reform method, natural method, psychological method, phonetic method, and anti-grammatical method, was established in France and Germany around 1900 and introduced in India in the early 20th century as a reform which was needed in the methods of teaching of English. This was developed, as Rao has pointed out, as a reaction against the grammar translation method. The major assumptions of this method were in opposition to the grammar translation method. Hence, it is considered as a reaction against the grammar translation method with a distinct grammatical bias. Again, this method is a logical extension of the natural method. It is also an offshoot of the behavior school of psychology. It insists that the key to all language learning lies in association. It stresses the need for direct association between experience and expression in the foreign language. The aim is to enable the learner to think in foreign language and to cultivate an unerring language sense. It recognizes that language sense has its roots in spoken language and lays stress on the oral approach. If such a direct association is not possible, the teacher can explain the meaning of new words by giving synonyms, a definition, explanation, or by inference from the context. The same technique with few modifications here and there can be followed in teaching compositions, oral or written. Many new words can be added to the vocabulary of the learner without the intervention of the mother tongue. The main aim of teaching English by this method is to enable the learner to think in English and to discourage the practice of inwardly thinking in one's vernacular and then overtly translating the thought into the foreign language. You should be able to grasp what he hears or reads in English and should be able to express his thoughts and wishes directly and fluently so that in due course of time he obtains a real command over the language. Classes are carried out totally in the second language with absolutely no reliance on the first language or any form of translation. The expectation is that through question and answer dialogue, the second language will gradually be acquired. Problems have arisen with such an approach because adults do not in fact learn exactly like children and they express the need for explicit instruction in grammar and other aspects of the second language. Teaching of receptive skills, listening and reading, rather than teaching of predictive skills, that is, speaking and writing, was encouraged as a first step. Contrastive analysis of the native language of the learner with the target language was done. Teachers are required to have a good knowledge of phonetics of the language they teach, but they would use it to teach pronunciation and not phonetics. As this method uses conversation as the main tool in the teaching of a foreign language, the other tools are discussion and reading in the target language itself. Grammar is taught inductively. W. F. Mackay points out that the main characteristics of this method as there is an ample scope for the use of everyday vocabulary and structures. Grammar is taught by creating situations through visual presentations. There is ample scope for extensive listening and imitation until form becomes automatic. Thus, it becomes evident that there is almost no scope for the learner's mother tongue. This method presupposes that a second language could be acquired as one acquires one's mother tongue through its ample natural exposure. Wilgar Rivers comments on this method as follows. A direct method class provided a clear contrast with the prevailing grammar translation classes. The course began with the learning of the foreign words and phrases for objects and actions in the classroom. When this could be used readily and appropriately, the learning moved to the common situations and settings of everyday life. The lesson often developing around specially constructed pictures of life in the country where the language was spoken. Where the meaning of words could not be made clear by concrete representation, the teacher resorted to miming, sketches, or explanation in the foreign language, but never supplied native language translations. From the beginning, the students were accustomed to hear complete and meaningful sentences which formed part of simple discourse, often in the form of a question answer interchange. Grammar was not taught explicitly but deductively as in the grammar translation class, but was learned largely through practice. Students were encouraged to draw their own structural generalizations from what they had been learning by an inductive process. In this way, the study of grammar was kept at a functional level, being confined to those which were continually being used in speech. When grammar was taught more systematically at a later stage, it was taught in a foreign language with the use of foreign language terminology. From the first statement, it becomes clear that this method discards the use of L1 even in teaching grammatical rules, favors the situational use of language, considers meaningful sentences at the core, teaches grammatical rules inductively, provides with ample opportunities to the students of using target language, takes care of the spoken aspects of the target language, and above all, seeks gradual development of all basic linguistic skills, namely LSRW, that is, listening, speaking, reading, and writing. The main reason of the failure of this method in Indian context is perhaps the death of expert teachers. Therefore, the direct method considered better than the previous grammar translation method was not completely free from certain weaknesses either. For one thing, the method is not all the direct, for only a limited number of words can be directly associated with their meanings or the objects they represent. Moreover, its main claim that it teaches a foreign language directly, not through the mother tongue, is only partly true. Commenting on the limitations of this method, Scott remarks, it is possible provided the teachers take efforts. The next one is the audio-lingual method. The audio-lingual method, ALM or audio-legalism, grew out of foreign language teaching approaches developed during the World War II at the University of Michigan in order to rapidly develop effective oral skills in foreign languages for military personnel. Charles Price and Robert Laudo are credited with the association of behaviorist psychology and a contrastive structural analysis of the target language to produce the following principles for foreign language learning. Foreign language learning is basically a process of mechanical habit formation. Good habits are formed by giving correct responses rather than by making mistakes. By memorizing dialogues and performing pattern drills, the chances of producing mistakes are minimized. Language skills are learned more effectively if the items to be learned in the target language are presented in spoken form before they are seen in written form. Analogy provides a better foundation for language learning than analysis. Analogy involves the process of generalization and discrimination. The meanings of the meanings that the words of a language have for native speakers can be learned only in a linguistic and cultural context and not in isolation. The audio-lingual method was thus based on the oral language, which was presented in small, carefully controlled structural units and practiced through mimicry, memorization, and drills and pattern practice. Errors were to be avoided at all costs since only good habits should be reinforced. The next one is Dr. Wirt's new method. Learning to read a language is by far the shortest road to speak and write it. This method is also known as reading method or textbook method. Dr. M.P. West, the former Director of Education and Principal of Training College Bengal in pre-independent India, was a profounder of this method. Dr. West says the child does not so much need to speak this second language, but rather to read it, a salient features of this method. The objective of this method is to promote silent readers. It is a revolt against a direct method which relies stress on speech. But Dr. West observed that the comprehension was the first condition required to become able to speak. As there are more chances of hearing incorrect English from the Indian students, this method therefore envisages emphasis on reading skill. This method permits the use of mother tongue wherever necessary. It helps to enhance the vocabulary of the learners. This method is economical in terms of money and time. Drawbacks of Dr. West's new method. Dr. West's notion that the ability to read should be preceded by the ability to speak doesn't seem sound because reading has some inner speech in it. Emphasis on reading rather than speech is against the psychological principle that we always learn a new language by first speaking it. Language is primarily speech. Silent way method. The silent way is one of the innovative methods. In fact, Caleb Catano, the founder of the silent way, devoted his thinking to the importance of problem solving approach in education. He contends that the method is constructivist and leads the learners to develop their own conceptual models of all the aspects of language. The best way of achieving this is to help students to be experimental learners. Features. The silent way is characterized by its focus on discovery, creativity, problem solving, and the use of accompanying materials. Richards and Rogers summarize the method into three major features. Learning is facilitated if the learner discovers or creates. The silent way belongs to the tradition of teaching that favors a hypothetical mode of teaching as opposed to expository mode of teaching, in which the teacher and the learner work cooperatively to reach the education desired goals. The learner is not a bench bound listener but an active contributor to the learning process. Learning is facilitated by accompanying or mediating physical objects. The silent way uses colorful charts and rods which are of varying length. They are used to introduce vocabulary, colors, numbers, adjectives, verbs, and syntax, tense, comparatives, plural, word order, etc. Learning is facilitated by problem solving involving the materials to be learned. This can be summarized by Benjamin Franklin's words: tell me I forget, teach me I remember, involve me and I learn. A good silent way learner is a good problem solver. The teacher's role resides only in giving minimum repetitions and corrections, remaining silent most of the times, leaving the learner struggling to solve the problems about the language and get a grasp of its mechanism. Disadvantages. The silent way is often criticized for being a harsh method. The learner works in isolation and communication is lacking badly in silent way classroom. With minimum help on the part of the teacher, the silent way method may put learning itself at stake. The material, the rods, the charts used in this method will certainly fail to introduce all the aspects of language. Other materials will have to be introduced. Advantages. Learning through problem solving looks attractive, especially because it fosters creativity, discovery, increase in intelligence, potency, and long term memory. The indirect role of the teacher highlights the importance and the centrality of the learner who is responsible about how language works. In other words, teaching is subordinated to learning. The next method is Total Physical Response Method, TPR. TPR stands for Total Physical Response and it was created by Dr. James J. Asher. It is based upon the way that children learn their mother tongue. parents have language body conversation with their children. The parents instructs the child physically responds to this. The parents says, "Look at mommy and give me the ball," and the child does so. These conversations continue for many months before the child actually starts to speak itself. Even though it can't speak during this time, the child is taking in all of the language, the sounds, and the patterns. Eventually, when it has decoded enough, the child reproduces the language quite spontaneously. TPR attempts to mirror this effect in the language classroom. In the classroom, the teacher plays the role of parent. He or she starts by saying the word jump or a phrase look at the board and demonstrating an action. The teacher then says the command and the students all do the action. After repeating a few times, it is possible to extend this by asking the students to repeat the word as they do the action. When they feel confident with the word or phrase, you can then ask the students to direct each other or the whole class. It is more effective if the students are standing in a circle around the teacher, and you can even encourage them to walk around as they do the action. TPR can be used to teach and practice many things. Vocabulary connected with action, smile, chop, headache, regal, etc. Tenses, past, present, future, and continuous aspects. Every morning I clean my teeth, I make my bed, I eat breakfast. Like this, we can teach them. A classroom language, open your books, imperative instructions can be given. Stand up, close your eyes like that. Storytelling is possible. It can be adapted for all kinds of teaching situations. We just need to use our imagination. Why should I use it in the classroom? It is a lot of fun. Students enjoy it and it can be a real stirrer in the class. It lifts the face and the mood. It is very memorable. It really helps students to remember phrases or words. It is good for kinos, kinesthetic learners who need to be active in the class. It can be used in large or small classes. It doesn't really matter how many students you have as long as you are prepared to take the lead and students are ready to follow. It works well with mixed ability classes. The physical actions get across the meaning effectively so that all the students are able to understand and use the target language. It doesn't require a lot of preparation or material. As long as you are clear and what you want to practice, a rehearsal beforehand can help. It won't take a lot of time to get ready. It is very effective with teenagers and young learners. It involves both left and right brain learning. Disadvantages of using TPR. Students who are not used to such things might find it embarrassing. Also, the students are in groups and don't have to perform for the whole class. This pressure is reserved for the teacher. It is only really suitable for the beginner levels, whilst it is clear that it is far more useful at lower levels because the target language lends itself to such activities. I have also used it successfully with intermediate and advanced levels. We need to adapt the language accordingly. We cannot teach everything with it, and if used a lot, it would become repetitive. It can be a successful and fun way of challenging the dynamics and pace of a lesson used in conjunction with the other methods and techniques. A dogme language teaching method. Approach is a communicative approach to language teaching that was initiated by Scott Thornby. As an approach, dogme has well grounded principles in language learning and learning theories. Features: learning as experimental and holistic, and language learning as an emergent, jointly constructed, and socially constituted process motivated both by communal and communicative interpretive imperatives. Dogma has its roots in communicative language teaching. Conversation is seen as central to language learning. Dogma also places more emphasis on a discourse level rather than sentence level approach to language. Dogme considers that the learning of a language skill is co-constructed within the interaction between the learner and the teacher. The dogma approach considers that student-produced material is preferable to be published materials and textbooks to the extent of inviting teachers to take a vow of chastity and not to use textbooks. Like task-based approach, dogma considers language learning to be a process where language learning emerges rather than one where it is acquired. A scaffold learning is assisted by the teacher through conversations and makes it possible for effective learning to take place. The teacher's role is to optimize language learning affordance, the environment where learners can potentially learn and direct their attention to emergent language. The learner's voice, beliefs, and knowledge are accepted. Criticism. Dogma can be a real challenge for the teachers in low resource context. Many teachers question the appropriateness of dogma in situations where the students are preparing for examination that are specific syllabi. A dogma creates problems for non-native and novice teachers who find in textbooks a safe guide. The initial call for a O of chastity not to use textbook is seen as unnecessarily purist and hinders the adoption of a weaker version of dogma. Merits. A dogma is compatible with the reflective teaching, more freedom for teachers and students to conceptualize and implement more appropriate material. Students are most engaged by content they have created themselves. Dogma has the merit of creating a low affective filter environment in the classroom. Learners follow their own pace of learning, assisted by the teacher through the scaffolding. Learning is humanized through a radical pedagogy of dialogue. Learners are freed from ideological load inherent in textbooks generally published in the West and commercialized all over the world. Dogma recognizes the legitimacy of learners' needs and expectations. Dogma gives teachers and learners the possibility to free themselves from the models of teaching and learning imposed by textbook writers. Conversations provide the opportunity for learners to analyze, internalize, and practice language. Communication is central in dogma approach. Peninsular language learning method. It is an audio-based language acquisition method developed by Paul Pimsleur. This method stresses active participation over rote memorization. The Pimsleur method was created nearly 50 years ago by Dr. Paul Pimsleur, an international language expert. He felt that there was a need for self-instructional materials to learn many of the world's languages. Principles of the approach. Pimsleur uses four principles to form memory association and language recall inherent in these lessons. These principles include anticipation. Students just don't repeat words and phrases in English, they translate a phrase into English. This technique is an active way of learning. The student needs to the students need to think before responding. Pimsleur felt this was similar to real phrase quickly. Graduated interval recall. This method of reviewing learned vocabulary allows the learners to review the vocabulary learned at increasingly longer intervals. For example, a word is introduced and practiced every few seconds. Eventually, it is practiced every minutes, then every few hours, and every few days. This method allows students to store the vocabulary into long-term memory. Core vocabulary. The Pimsleur method focuses on commonly used words to build up a core vocabulary. For example, in the English language, a specific set of 2000 words makes up nearly 80% of the total printed words. So, for each level in English, there is an average of 500 words spread across 30 lessons. Grammar is presented through common patterns and phrases. It is repeated at intervals throughout the course. This matches how native speakers as children learn grammar. Organic learning. This method of listening to learn English helps with the proper pronunciation of words with the correct accent. Michael Thomas method. With Thomas method, the teacher cautions students to avoid making notes and refrain from making conscious attempts to memorize, promising that the teacher will be taking full responsibility for their learning. Thomas stated that keeping the students relaxed, focused, and stretched with a feeling of mounting successful achievement lies at the heart of the method. The removal of the stress and anxiety of being put on the spot of conventional language learning, especially school language learning, is a key advantage of the method. The teacher introduces short words and phrases in the target language. Meaning is usually conveyed via the student's mother tongue. The students are asked how they would say a phrase in the target language, starting with simple sentences and gradually building up to more advanced constructions. The phrases are chosen as common building blocks of the language structure. When a student gives a correct answer, the teacher repeats the entire sentence with correct pronunciation. When the student's answer is incorrect, the teacher helps the student to understand their mistake and to correct it. The most important words and phrases are reviewed repeatedly during the course. The method does not insist on perfect pronunciation from the beginning. Instead of providing progressive feedback and continual improvement by the process of shaping student response over the course of these repetitions. Grammar rules are introduced gradually and grammatical terminology is generally avoided. In this way, the course builds complexity quickly, building the skills required to translate sentences like, I want to know why you don't have it for me now, because it is very important for me and I need it, while avoiding much of the vocabulary and fixed phrases presented in most mainstream courses. Michael Thomas often links the cognates in the target language with their equivalents in the student's home language, and in his courses the Romance languages, many of the Latinate borrowings in English are highlighted to allow the student to incorporate their existing vocabulary into the target language. Computer assisted language learning, otherwise called CALL method. The real advance in the use of computers in language teaching came with the transition from the floppy disk to compact disc series as a basic form of software. The the email as a means of communication, and most importantly, with the arrival of the internet as a widely available resource. Today, there is a vast array of language teaching materials available on CD-ROM or DVD, ranging from self-study materials to supplement published course books to ESP based courses and culture based materials. Many learners of English have access to email and the internet at home as well as at school, and this presents teachers with a range of useful options in terms of setting writing tasks, communicating with learners by email, giving learners research tasks, and setting up a project work based on researching in the internet. Where previously such a task would have involved a great deal of letter writing on the part of both teachers and learners, on the other hand, on the one hand, and a potentially time consuming visit to the local library on the other, they can now be accomplished quickly and easily without the learner ever having to leave his house but using a personal computer. Although many learners seem to be much more familiar with the use of computers than a lot of teachers appear to be, there is still a plenty of scope for some input in class related to computers. Basic terminology is a good starting point, and a useful exercise may be the pronunciation of email and internet addresses such as jblogs at newmail.com or onestopenglish.com. Similarly, there may be some value in teaching the meta language of word processing, example copy, cut, paste, insert, writing emails, example reply, forward, delete, and surfing the internet, example search, link, keyword, and so on. Many UK language schools are now responding to the specific needs of learners and offering computer based options leading to word processing qualifications such as the UK based CLIET validated by the RSA and the American MOU's qualifications validated by Microsoft. In both the cases, certificates are offered for different levels of competence, from basic user to proficient users, and both practice activities and examinations are offered online. In terms of practical classroom activities to exploit the internet, if teachers have access to several internet linked computers for use in their classes, there are numerous possibilities. Learners can fill in on online questionnaires, research specific topics, prepare presentations using online information, graphs, and diagrams, find the answers to questions sent by the teachers, do interactive grammar, vocabulary, and even pronunciation exercises, read and summarize the latest news, and contribute to online discussions and debates. With technology advancing at a breakneck speed, it sometimes seems difficult for teachers to keep up, but remaining informed is crucial. Our learners may already be several steps ahead in this area, and to retain credibility, we need to be familiar with the latest developments in computer technology and to be able to integrate computers confidently into our everyday classroom practice. Learning by teaching method. Experience is the best teacher. Anyone who has never had any noteworthy learning experience in life can attest to the truth in this statement. It really is true that we learn more when we do things ourselves. In fact, it was probably a lot easier to understand the concepts when you experimented with you yourselves in the laboratory. The same principle holds true for learning languages, especially English for kids. Learning by doing, children's brains are like sponges that soak up pertinent information. They can grasp concepts easily and can assimilate a new language faster. It is therefore at this point in life when it is best to introduce a new language. And the best way for a child to learn language is for him to actually use it in speaking and in writing. The grammar rules will remain as simple and forgettable rules unless you start applying them to actual conversations or compositions. The more your child does something, the more comfortable he becomes with it and uh, easier it becomes easier for him. It's like riding a bike. At first, he will start off all and unstable, but after a few tries, it will become second nature to him. English grammar for kids is like that too. The more your child speaks English, the faster he or she learns it because it is a skill language. It is a skill subject rather. Try to expose your child to the English environment by watching TV in English, listening to songs in English, reading English books, or playing English games on the internet. As a last point above, we can use games for learning English to make it easier for our children to grasp the language more. There are English songs for kids that they can sing, or English dictionary for kids with lots of colorful pictures. There are many how to learn English for kids and edutainment products in the market that we can use and make it a fun English for kids learning experience to help them grasp the language faster. Obstacles to this type of learning. However, we have to be careful in giving criticism. Grammar mistakes can be rather funny, and some people are prone to being unjustly mean when criticizing. Criticism should always be constructive. This holds true especially for children who are learning to speak in English. Some kids are very hesitant to use a language for fear that they might say something awkward and completely wrong. Mistakes, however, are to be expected, and it is important that the child knows this that you will not be afraid to actually use the language. After all, that's how we all learn. Mixed ability grouping method. All classes are mixed ability to one extent or another. Extreme cases when you have near native level speakers with beginners can be very challenging for the teachers. In these cases, it's important to remember that all students will get something out of the class, but not necessarily the same thing and not necessarily what you aim to teach them. For example, the beginners may begin to get a grasp of our classroom language, while the stronger students may begin to be able to put a new tense into use. Adapting materials for mixed ability classes can take different forms. One way to adapt materials is to rewrite reading text and grade language accordingly for different levels. In an ideal world where a teacher has all the time in the world to prepare their classes, this may be the perfect solution. However, the reality is that this sort of adaptation is extremely time consuming and not many teachers can actually go to this length to adapt materials for mixed level groups. Another problem that can arise with this sort of adaptation is that it can be awkward to give out different texts to different students. There is a danger that they will instantly realize that they have been labeled as a weak or strong student, and in the case of weaker students, this will no doubt affect their motivation because they will be demotivated. Tips for good classroom management with mixed ability groups. Grouping. It may seem contradictory to suggest that we group stronger students together and also suggest that we group weak with strong. However, depending on the task and the class dynamics, there are usually opportunities for both types of grouping. It's a good idea to experiment with the mixing of the strong and weak students whilst also giving time for stronger students to work together with the weak students so that they work to fulfill their potentiality. Giving instructions. Giving clear instructions is vital for weaker students to be able to follow the class. Use hand gestures as well as words to explain the task, and use stronger students to check back the instructions and even explain the task in their own language if necessary. Error correction is an important element in this method. Stronger students can probably stand more correction. Don't cover correct weak students. Don't don't overcorrect weak students as it will affect their confidence. Encourage students to correct one another and demand a higher level of accuracy from the stronger students. Setting goals for each class or for the whole term will help to focus for the students. The goals can be different for each student depending on their level, but realizing the goals will give that same sense of achievement to all. So, in this class, we discussed about various methods of teaching of English. We have to remember in our classroom, the students have so many individual differences, and depending upon the students we face in our class, we have to stick to a method which is appropriate and more convenient and which will make our teaching of English more effective to the target group of students. In the next class, we will discuss about the approaches, various approaches of teaching of English. Thank you for your patient listening. Thank you. See you in the next class. Till then, bye.